Hi, everybody. This is Liz Stanton at Synapse, and we're just ready to get going on our webinar for today, The Changing Face of Electric Resource Planning. And we've got a couple of great presenters here just ready to go, Jeremy Fisher and Patrick Luckow. And I also have with me today a co-host and moderator, Ariel Horowitz. And Ariel's going to start us off by letting us know about the logistics for the webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone. So just so you know, the webinar is being recorded and the slides will be circulated to all the attendees, as well as a recording of the webinar. All attendees have been muted on entry and will remain muted throughout the webinar. If you have any questions about the content of the webinar, please send those to webinar@synapse-energy.com. During the Q&A session, the panelists will be answering questions that come into that email address. If you have any technical problems, such as with the audio or with the visual of the slides, you can let the host know through the WebEx chat function.
Great, and as always, we really want to get your questions, so please start sending them in at any time, and Ariel and I will be monitoring the questions that you're sending in. We'll be monitoring that webinar at email, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll start passing those questions along to the presenters to answer. First, a little bit on Synapse. I know so many of you are already familiar with us, but for those that aren't, we're a research and consulting firm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we specialize in energy, economics, and environmental topics. We do a lot of work for both consumer and environmental advocates as well as for government agencies. And you can read all about us on our website and get a sense of the different services that we provide. One of the kinds of services that we provide is to help various stakeholders out in IRP processes. And we today and in the past have had various clients related to integrated resource planning and have a lot of great expertise on staff, including your presenters today. You should be aware that we're very mindful that we have current projects going on related to specific IRP plans, and for that reason, we're going to keep our presentation general, not delve into the specifics of those current projects. Ariel?
So to introduce our presenters, Dr. Jeremy Fisher is a principal at Synapse and heads Synapse resource planning practice. He has been evaluating, reviewing, and assessing utility resource plans at Synapse for the past decade. And Patrick Luckow is a senior associate and Synapse chief modeler with extensive experience running utility scale models and analyzing utility IRPs. So, Jeremy?
Thanks, Ariel, and thanks, Liz. And it's a pleasure to have this group on with me today. This is an area today that we've been very vested in at Synapse, and I'm personally very interested in, which is sort of the evolving face of integrated resource planning and what happens within integrated resource planning. So today we're going to be sort of walking through a little bit of what an IRP actually is, but really we're going to be talking much more about some of the changing issues in integrated resource planning and how these issues are affecting resource plans that are coming out today, and we expect over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, sort of what the next generation is going forward. So on the agenda, I'm going to be talking about sort of 5 key issues that we see going into resource planning right now. Flat load and how that's impacting resource plans, environmental policies, how we think about the value of existing generation, competitive energy efficiency and renewable integration. And then once you wrap up with those, Patrick will be kicking into talking about the next generation of resource planning and some of the models that are coming out and some of those considerations. Obviously, we would love to hear your questions. Please do send them to webinar@synapse-energy.com to go through. So starting off, I'm going to try to address this basic fundamental question of what is an IRP. Hopefully, if you're interested in this talk, you have at least some sense of resource planning. But just to put us all on the same page, we think of an IRP as a plan that seeks to find an optimal combination of resources that satisfy future demands. So that's a Very generic type of statement. It's one that's used across most IRP rules in front of most commissions in most states. Then there are additional requirements that are on top of that. Usually requires an examination, requirement to examine both supply and demand side resources on a fair and consistent basis, or something similar to that. And of course, resource planning has to be subject to constraints such as reliability and regulatory and operational requirements, and any form of environmental rules too. A question from Ariel.
Jeremy, you mentioned the term optimal here. What does optimal mean in the context of IRP?
Sure. Thanks, Ariel. So when we use the term optimal, we're thinking of something that meets the best possible needs or seeks a particular objective function. So when we're looking at a resource plan that's looking for a best or least cost, we're seeking something that actually does find that least cost outcome. And so optimal in this case generally means looking for that least cost solution subject to risk constraints and subject to other constraints. And as we get into question and answer, we can go back and reapproach whether optimal is really what we need to be aiming for, as opposed to just best in context of knowable risk. IRPs in general we think of as meant to engage regulators and stakeholders. An IRP really is a public information gathering and information distribution process that's used by a utility to try to convey a sense of where they would like to be going in their overall resource planning. It's looking to make robust short-term decisions in light of long-term uncertainty, and that requires stakeholder input. A real brief history of integrated resource planning. Back in the 1970s, everyone's familiar with the energy crisis, where we had rising fuel prices, increasing capital construction costs, and at the same time, with the Clean Air Act and new changes that we're having for environmental costs, we're having a completely new understanding of what was meant for utilities to be able to build out their their generation in order to meet customer requirements. It started coming around to this idea of what least cost planning really could mean. This was recognized as we started hitting the nuclear boom in the 1980s and early 1990s, where in a series of both very high cost cases where nuclear units, in some cases large coal-fired units, ran significantly over budget, as well as hydro issues in the Northwest, Congress and states both sort of simultaneously recognized that it made sense to start looking at long-term resource planning. So in the Northwest, we got the Pacific Northwest Electric Power Planning and Conservation Act, which is a multi-state integrated resource planning mechanism. And in the early 1990s, a number of states began promulgating IRP rules to try to ensure that they wouldn't be running up against large stranded assets from future investments. That led to a whole new slate of tools that allowed us to think about least cost long-term planning. But those types of tools that were developed at the time were really thought about for new resources and didn't really revisit existing resources. So it was a very basic slate of tools that came out in that era of the early 90s. They've really developed since. In the late 1990s, we had restructuring across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic and some of the Midwest as well as California, and that really wiped out a good portion of long-term resource planning in those competitive access states. Of course, not excluding Texas there either. As we started coming towards the late 2000s, states started revisiting procurement planning where they started looking at things that looked like an IRP in those competitive states. Today, IRP is required in 30-some-odd states. This is a graphic that's from EPA's Energy and Environment Guide to Action, showing where those IRP requirements are right now. And just sort of as an update to that, California is moving to implement IRP. Tennessee produces IRPs via TVA. There is no requirement for it, however. And Puerto Rico recently enacted a new IRP requirement as of 2015. So now some of the issues that have been changing within the IRP world. And I think one of the most important overall is that the overall general construct of what an IRP is really supposed to mean has sort of shifted as we've gone from an era in which demand was on a constant, steady push of 6 to 10% per year of steady growth, where you just always had to be building the next resource, to a shift from the 70s through the early 2000s, where we really shifted down in the amount of growth that we were having on an annual basis, down to more recently where we're really not seeing tremendous growth in the electricity sector because of both decreasing demand at a fundamental level on a per capita basis, as well as energy efficiency measures, and to some extent changes in the economy and the way that we're using electricity as an overall economy. So what I'm showing here on the right is a graphic that just shows on a log scale, please note that log scale, changes in U.S. electricity consumption from 1950 through a projection of 2040 from Energy Information Administration in 2016. And it shows sort of what I think of as these three different phases of electricity growth: the pre-1973 energy crisis, followed by a slower growth from 1974 to the financial crisis of 2008, and sort of this fundamental shift that it seems like we're seeing right now to this flatter load growth. And so when you were previously in a paradigm of constant growth, that meant you were looking at one set of resource planning, and now that we're not actually looking at continuous growth, we're really looking at a very different paradigm. And so planning really is considering what units you have today and how those units compare to what kinds of fleet that you could have moving forward, rather than just adding the next incremental thing.
Jeremy, while you're on this slide, let me anticipate a couple of questions that folks might have. One, I'll just say them both, and then you and Patrick can respond. The first is, can you just help people out with the log scale? Tell us, if I saw a 45-degree line, it would mean, or something like that, to help people. And then the second thing is, I'm looking at the black section, which is the newest AEO projections.
Yep.
In the projections that you're showing there, what are they thinking about EV and other kinds of electrification? Are they? I mean, Patrick might know that one. Have they put any of that in? Just a touch?
Just a touch, very limited. I mean, that's definitely a key uncertainty in load forecasting going forward, especially as we think about long-term climate mitigation type scenarios. I mean, increasing electrification both for EVs and in the buildings and commercial sectors can play a significant role, and I don't think all of that would be reflected in the current policies implementation of AEO 2016.
Yeah.
And just go back to the log scale. What the log scale in this case shows us is it's turning exponential curves that grow year on year faster and faster, into straight lines. And so in that first orange segment, if we were to look at that on a normal scale like you're used to seeing, what we'd see there instead of a straight line is we'd see growth that year on year increases such that it's continually sloping further and further up. So every year it grows by an additional incremental 6 to 10%.
It's growing faster and faster.
It grows faster and faster every year, that's right. And we're just not seeing that level of growth. So this is, you would see these same types of trends if we showed this in a non-log scale. It just shows up much more clearly in terms of these very distinct segments in this scalar.
Thank you.
Sure. So the second thing that I'm identifying as a big change in IRPs over the course of the last couple of years and moving forward is our treatment of environmental policies and where we sort of stand today. And we've heard a lot of discussion through the industry of the impact of environmental policies that have been promulgated and continue to be promulgated through the last couple of years. But I think the interesting part that I'm going to focus in on here is how it's been treated by the electric sector. So I'd say that prior to 2010, there really was an entirely sector-wide blind spot with respect to looking forward on environmental policies altogether. Very little practice in looking at the impact that those policies had on either the dispatch, frankly, or the existence of our existing units. And there's really a sort of cutting-edge NERC study back in 2010 that was looking at the reliability implications, but really started to focus in on this question of, will it make sense to actually keep around all of our existing units in the face of changing fuel prices, changing electricity prices, changing demand, and of course environmental policies. That sort of kicked off this flurry of utilities and third parties, including ourselves, looking at the impact of these environmental regulations on a going forward basis. And in the utility sector, you started getting IRPs that variously included or chose to neglect impending regulations and really thought about their existing asset values, whether those assets were impaired by having these environmental regulations or not. And there's some jurisdictions that said, you know what, if it's not on the books right now, we're not going to look at it. And there's some jurisdictions that thought very carefully about what types of environmental regs were coming downstream and what that could mean for their assets. But there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of what the next series of environmental regs might mean in terms of their cost or their operational constraints. And so I'm terming that the era of serious uncertainty. As we started moving into late 2014, mid-2015, and now, for the most part, a lot of those environmental regs have been hammered down, with a couple of notable exceptions, including Clean Power Plan. But there's at least a recognition within the industry that there's a real potential for existing assets to be impaired by those environmental regulations, as well as massive changes in fuel prices and demand. And so with all of those combined together, it made sense for IRPs to really be taking a look at those impacts and really think about them in a much more integrated basis. When I say standardization of practice, I don't mean that everyone's actually doing it right. I just mean that there's at least recognition in the industry that this is something that really makes a difference. This third point here, I'm going to focus on existing generation value. And this goes right back to that same question of what was happening with changes in environmental regulations and looking back at your own existing assets. I'm just going to go ahead and state declaratively that I don't believe a plan can actually be least cost without having evaluated the cost effectiveness of existing supply-side resources. And there's a point at which that was partially true, and I think that that's actually very true now. Existing assets today, particularly solid fuel assets or coal-fired assets, are really dispatching less today on a significant basis than just 5 or 7 years ago. Falling gas and electricity prices, emissions control prices, and emissions prices themselves, as well as increasing fuel costs, are leaving a lot of units in a space where they're actually marginal on today's electricity market. Utilities previously really gave no attention to short-term variable costs of those units in either IRPs or in even some cases dispatch, and that's not really the case any longer. As a matter of fact, we were just looking at a study that just recently came out from MISO looking at the impacts of the Clean Power Plan, very similar to the way that an IRP might be structured, and they found this sort of interesting issue where going forward a number of the coal units were just not committing, just choosing not to operate at all due to high variable price. It's one of those issues that I think impacts the way that we look at long-term planning and the way that we have to rejigger the way that we're thinking about assets that were previously just straight up baseload. Overall, both nuclear and coal and other steam-fired units are just becoming less competitive over the long term. Back in 2010 to 2014, utilities were slowly starting to test the economic viability of those units, and really just the ones that required capital investments. And now we're sort of running into this world in which there's sort of this long-term revenue deficit for high fixed cost units. And we're increasingly starting to see utilities think about even their units that don't require capital investments, what's the future of maintaining or not maintaining those. A lot of that hinges on long-term fuel price forecasts. You know, will energy prices increase enough to actually support those units or not? And that's sort of an open-ended question that I think a lot of utilities are struggling with today. The fourth area that I'm going to dive into is how we're treating energy efficiency and demand-side management in general. And there's sort of two options and two paradigms that might be more or less invisible to casual readers of IRPs or casual users of IRPs, but I think they're really quite different, and we're seeing a little bit of a shift in the way that both commissions are thinking about energy efficiency and utilities as well. We've previously thought about energy efficiency in sort of its simplest form. Energy efficiency is a load reduction. You just sort of take energy efficiency out of the requirements on a going forward basis. You assign a cost to the energy efficiency that you think you've implemented, and you just run your world as if that energy efficiency already existed. One of the problems with that is that it's very difficult to evaluate energy efficiency as a dynamic response to your prices. So let's say that the price of your electricity sector is increasing substantially in one of your scenarios. You might think that additional energy efficiency might be a mechanism that you could use to mitigate that price. But if you're hard-coded in energy efficiency as a load reduction, you're just not going to get that as part of your IRP response. And so it sort of misses some component of effective planning if you're not able to actually capture that responsivity of energy efficiency. There's this emerging mechanism of putting energy efficiency on the supply side where you're thinking about energy efficiency competing with new and existing resources. And it's sort of the way that we'd like to think about energy efficiency in an idealized sense. Energy efficiency is this thing that's a competitive resource. It's something that we can stick into our models and have the model choose instead of choosing to build, say, a new supply-side resource. But it's a really complicated implementation. You know, are you going to model individual programs, or are you going to think about large blocks of programs? If you're thinking about today's savings, do those savings really persist? How long? If you can get it done, it can be readily adapted to changing economic conditions, and it can really reduce your uncertainty in the way that you're thinking about your energy efficiency programs, but it's pretty complicated.
Jeremy, can I jump in on that quickly? As somebody who's setting up these models frequently, getting it done on the supply side is really tricky, as you said. I mean, beyond just characterizing the inputs properly, I mean, given a lot of the costs for energy efficiency we've seen, if you put them in models like this, it just takes all of it, and maybe that's not realistic. So I mean, is it necessarily wrong to think about it as a load reduction? It's simpler, and as a modeler, we like to have the model decide things, but sometimes the model just can't reflect all the real-world considerations that come into play in these decisions.
No, that's true. And I think that's one of the difficulties that modelers are really struggling with, is that the implementation of energy efficiency as a supply side is both complicated, arduous, and somewhat dependent on assumptions that we make about our system today versus what we think is actually reasonable over the long run. So it really does have some drawbacks in that type of consideration. On the other hand, it gives you a lot more clarity about the impact that energy efficiency can have as you start to change the signals of the rest of your system, and I think serves as a good reminder that energy efficiency can serve as one of these ways of mitigating price increases elsewhere. So from a practical standpoint, I think it's something that's worthwhile for utilities and commissions to look into. I think it needs to be approached cautiously. I think energy efficiency as a load reduction probably still serves as a reasonable default in most jurisdictions, but needs to be considered sort of in a range of how can you get different price points for different levels of energy efficiency so that you can really determine if you're hitting a close to optimal amount. I think that's still within reach right now of being able to get energy efficiency along a different spectrum.
Yeah, for sure. And we see all over the place requirements that people consider demand-side measures on a similar framework as supply-side measures.
But practically speaking, it's really difficult to do.
Yeah, exactly.
That's true. The last area I'm going to talk about for now before passing over the buck to Patrick is dealing with renewable integration in distributed generation. And this is one of those areas where the technical challenges are fairly substantial right now, and I think Patrick will be addressing some of the technological solutions that utility modelers are starting to look at going forward. But in the past, renewable energy was a fairly small role in the overall generation mix for most utilities, and so using a simplified representation of renewable energy was okay. Doing something along the lines of saying, you know, here's a representational load shape for a small amount of wind or a small amount of solar, or something where you'll just take the equivalent capacity factor on an hourly basis was close enough. But now that we're getting to the point where we've got dropping costs large-scale renewable policies, it's becoming more important to capture those operational impacts and capacity contributions. And there's some jurisdictions, and Patrick could probably talk to this more than I could, like Hawaii and Puerto Rico and some others, where the amount of renewable energy that's being looked at on those systems, California as well, are substantial enough that you're starting to migrate into the area where you need to consider operational constraints at the same time that you're also looking at long-term lease cost. And so the simplified representations that we've previously thought about might be inadequate. Hopefully Patrick will be able to talk a little bit more about some of the tech and some of the different modeling mechanisms that are being thought about in order to be able to think about renewable energy at the same time as long-term resource planning. Distributed generation sort of takes the same problem and makes it even a little bit harder because now it's behind the meter generation, and rather than being something where you can look at the optimal amount that the utility would otherwise procure, you sort of have to think about what our ratepayer is going to do behind the meter due to possibly either the price signals that the utility is sending out or due to other rate policies that are set by the state. It used to be a small reduction to load, in some states no longer. So not only do the cost of your resource plan influence your expected distributed generation build-out, but you might need to even start thinking about distribution level analyses in addition to transmission area analyses, which just brings your level of detail in these models down to a level of granularity that we previously hadn't had to deal with. So I'm going to stop there for a half a moment. I'm going to remind you that questions can be sent over to webinar@synapse-energy.com. And please do hammer us with questions. We're looking forward to it. And I'm going to pass the chair over to Patrick.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. I'm going to keep this pretty high level, but as Jeremy said, feel free to chime in with questions if more detail would be helpful on certain aspects. So to start off, I wanted to highlight a few of the key development model developers are looking at as far as producing models that address some of the challenges that Jeremy was talking about. One of the first ones that I've seen several times is thinking about long-term models with more operational detail. So typically the long-term models that are used in integrated resource planning have a quite limited treatment of dispatch, whether it's just a small subset of hours within each of several representative months or whether loads are binned into segments. Typically that sort of approach makes it really challenging to deal with things like wind and solar fluctuations where you have to deal with ramping requirements and startups and shutdowns on a very high level of operational detail. And we're starting to see more models that can do a better job of that. There's still some limitation. I mean, computing power has come a long way, but it's not unlimited for sure. So there's still trade-offs as far as you can't model 8760 hours every year with all ramping, thinking about unit commitment and thinking about 1,000 different new resource options. It's tricky. So people are thinking about ways to do this in a practical way that informs these questions. The next big thing is cloud-based platforms. This is less of a way to do better planning, but it contributes to it in one way. It makes it much easier to deal with those computational challenges. You can rapidly scale up your computational capacity for a small period of time using these cloud-based computational platforms, and you don't have to invest in a supercomputer at your site where you might not be able to justify a long-term expense of that investment. And cloud-based platforms have this added benefit of they're always there. You don't need a staff on site to troubleshoot them all the time. The next big thing is gas supply integration. As we think about a system that has maybe less coal and more natural gas, the supply of gas to new gas plants is contingent on pipeline availability. And how we've seen this done historically is maybe you assume supply is unlimited, maybe you assume there's a fixed pipeline that goes along with your resource expansion, but it hasn't been integrated in the sense that you think about all of these things at the same time. And so some of the new models are trying to do that in a more informative way, so you can do those decisions of whether or not it makes sense to invest in a new gas plant if you have to expand your pipeline capacity at the same time.
Patrick, can I pause you here for a sec? We're talking about computational power being a potential limit, but new power plants are expensive, hundreds of millions of dollars. And a bigger computer is only a little bit more expensive than my computer right now, on the order of tens of thousands of dollars. Why is it that computational power is our limit? What are we running into there that's really a problem? Is that really is it actually a practical problem, or is it just a reticence to adapt to new technology?
I mean, I think there's surely some organizational reticence to make huge investments in new computational requirements. But yeah, as you said, these investments might be modest compared to the power plant investments. But just logistically, I mean, when you think about doing a model run that might take several days or a week to run, it's just hard to integrate that into your planning process. You can wait for it, but it's not going to solve all your problems. Okay, let's move on. This is a little repetitive with what Jeremy talked about, but I just want to highlight how these new developments relate to a couple key issues. So as Jeremy mentioned, distribution level planning is something people are starting to discuss as we get more and more distributed generation, particularly rooftop PV. Circuits are stressed, and we have to think about what investments might be required at that level. Typically, that's been an entirely separated planning exercise, but rooftop PV can compose an important fraction of a system's generation, and there's definitely value in thinking about them, even if they're not in the same modeling construct, at the same time in a more integrated fashion. Another thing is storage. Along the lines of the limited operational capabilities I was just discussing, storage is really tricky to model without having that hour-to-hour capability. So you know when you can charge, discharge, what ancillary services it can contribute to. And storage has the potential to contribute to all of those things in a way that might not be captured by many of these more limited models. So I think a lot of folks are trying to wrestle with that and figure out the best way to value storage appropriately in this context. And then the last one that kind of pulls all these together is maintaining the importance of an inclusive stakeholder process. It's really tricky. I mean, it's hard to do when you have these really detailed models. The license fees might be substantial, just the analytical chops required to review all the inputs and outputs are significant. It's hard for stakeholders to actively engage, but I think it's important to facilitate that process as much as possible to get input that can be valuable and very helpful to the utility in their planning decision. And then the last thing I wanted to hit on was the value of state energy planning in addition to utility energy planning. More and more we've been seeing states legislate particular energy-related issues. So historically, that's been energy efficiency and renewable portfolio standards. But more recently, we've seen all sorts of requirements for long-term contracts. Massachusetts recently passed an energy bill that required long-term contracts for offshore wind. We're seeing things like discussions around the incentives to maintain nuclear plants who've been struggling to meet their revenue requirements given recent low market prices. And these issues have been very present in New York and Illinois, but I think they're also going to come up in a number of other jurisdictions. Distributed generation incentives, so how do we properly incentivize the value that rooftop PV can provide to the grid? And this is something that could be done on a utility level, but it's also being done on a state level frequently because it's an issue that's very important to voters. And then clean power planning is something that isn't always, it's sometimes done independently of IRP planning, but it looks very similar. and the Clean Power Plant standards are relevant at the state level. So some of this planning that might encompass several utilities operating within a state is very valuable. Some states have been thinking about this already. Connecticut has done an IRP for a number of years. New Jersey recently released an energy master plan. California does things a little differently. They're starting to think about an IRP just now, but historically they've done long-term procurement planning at a larger level where they do detailed modeling to inform what levels of procurement they need. But I think we'll see more and more of this, and it can provide a lot of value in terms of legislating energy policy at a state level that makes the most sense for utilities and customers and all the stakeholders involved. So just to wrap things up a little bit, Jeremy talked about the history of IRPs, why they're important, how they've been used in the past, and how things have shifted recently. And the tools are adapting to facilitate that. But not everything has been answered yet. It's a challenge. I mean, planning for 20, 30 years out into the future, even if your focus is an action plan 2 or 5 years into the future, is hard to do. Inputs are uncertain, but it's important to do the best we can because there's so much at stake here. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Liz to wrap things up.
Well, thank you, Patrick, and thanks also, Jeremy. That was a great presentation. I think you've gone through a lot of really useful material here, and I know we've already got questions coming in from our participants, and in just a moment we're going to start passing those along to you. I do want to hit a few housekeeping details before we go to questions. So we'd love to collaborate with you. Reach out to us, and we're interested to learn what all of you are working on right now and how we could be helping you out with that or just sharing information. So we're always glad to talk or to email back and forth. We also have a lot of resources that are available up on our website. We've put just a few here, so we'll get the slides later on sent to you, and it'll also be posted up online. But there's a few things that those of you interested in IRP and planning more generally may find of use. And finally, this was the 4th in our 5-webinar series for June. We've got one more coming to you next week. All of the other ones have been on a Thursday, so please note that next week's is on the Wednesday. Same time, 2 o'clock, we'll be looking at new renewable generation capacity, why here and not there. So Ariel now is going to start us off with a question, and we'll just go on from there.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks again, Patrick and Jeremy, for such an interesting presentation. You discussed a lot of the considerations for performing planning and what goes into making a plan, but are all IRPs created equal? How do you know when you have a good IRP at the end?
Oh, all IRPs are great. It's a good question. We've been tracking IRPs here at Synapse for well over the last decade. Prior to me being around, I think we were involved in the creation of some of the early IRPs in the mid-90s, and we sort of keep a large database of resource planning here. And one of the things that we try to do is go through and look at what the process is, what the mechanisms are of those IRPs, and how they respond to both policy needs and stakeholder needs. So I guess I'd characterize it maybe like 3 things that make a decent IRP. I think that there needs to be, as Patrick's sort of saying at the end there, a really good process of integrating stakeholder and regulator feedback. IRPs are not an internal utility process that happen in a vacuum, or they shouldn't be. There are other planning processes that happen at the utilities, but IRPs are really the mechanism of both being able to gather stakeholder and regulator input, make sure that it's being well considered, making sure that you're making a broad range of reasonable plans. I think number 2 in that is probably looking at a good modeling framework. There are a variety of ways to conduct analyses out there, and not all of them are appropriate for the types of questions that you have. So I think choosing the type of analytical framework that actually answers the question that you have is important. And as we go downstream, I can talk a little bit about some of the types of IRPs that we see that maybe aren't using the right tools for the right questions, or some of the ones that really do. And then I think the last part is then taking that detail and care and time that are necessary to really make sure that you've got the right inputs used in your model and that you're actually reflecting the constraints on your system in a reasonable and thoughtful way. There are, as Patrick could probably tell you, it seems like there are 1,001 ways to jigger these models and work with these models in a way where you can end up with outcomes that are either non-intuitive or don't necessarily reflect the system in a reasonable way. And so making sure that you've actually calibrated the model appropriately and taking the time to make sure that the model actually reflects your system, I think are pieces that occur to me. Patrick, do you sort of have thoughts in addition?
No, I think that hits it. It's always astounded me just the range of IRPs that we come across.
Anywhere from 2 pages to 250 pages. Yeah.
But I think just hitting on some of a few of the key things that you just mentioned can go a long ways towards developing a very helpful, useful IRP that can guide planning for the next several years.
Thank you. So I've got some questions coming in here, and one of them is about setting a baseline for an IRP, setting the baseline or the reference case. We know that typically in planning and modeling processes generally that we want to be able to compare a new and interesting future to some baseline. Can you talk a little bit about how to correctly set a baseline, what we expect to see there, and then in particular touch on energy efficiency? Say, what do we expect to see in the baseline for energy efficiency? What are the data sources?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, setting a reasonable reference case is very important. I mean, analyzing the risk of your plan is a key component of integrated resource planning, but sometimes we'll see this done in a way that analyzes all the edges but not the center, the most likely future. And I think that's really the most important thing, because what an integrated resource plan needs to come out with is a guideline for the future. And so you can't just have a bunch of uncertainty. You need to wrestle that into a plan. So to do that, you have to do the best job you can of developing reference case forecasts for all of your inputs. And that's not easy, but the information is out there. There's lots of people that think about forecasting in a reasonable way. Energy efficiency is tricky. I mean, it's important to include all the energy efficiency that's embedded in the policies that people are aware of. So whether it's an energy efficiency resource standard in your state or federal appliance standards, all those things should go into your future energy efficiency forecast. But that should also be coupled with a reasonable understanding of how energy efficiency can contribute as a resource, as we were talking about earlier in this presentation.
So when you're talking to folks that are stakeholders in an IRP process, is the construction of the baseline one of the things that you're working on with them to keep an eye on, and to in what way? What do you see as important there?
This is Jeremy. I'll respond to that one. I think the construction of that baseline is key, but I think also reasonable parties can choose to disagree on what they actually see as being baseline assumptions. So I think Patrick hit the nail on the head. At the end of the day, the IRP does need to come up with a series of decisions. It needs to come up with an action plan, something that's actually going to emerge out of the IRP. And for that, you need to, I think you nicely put it, wrestle those uncertainties into guidance. And so it might be that the utility comes up with a set of reference case assumptions that you as a stakeholder may disagree with, or a regulator disagree with. And that's where I think some of these uncertainties and sensitivities also come into play, is that you at least have enough information before you to be able to say, well, this is the type of thing that I would consider to be more of the reference case, and I have a series of information that supports my reason why this is a reference case, or a regulator might think that there's a reason that something else is a better reference case. But at the end of the day, you sort of need to decide what that thing is that you're going to choose as your reference case is. And I think there are a ton and a half of data sources that you can rely on both in the public and private sector, in terms of what types of things we think of as reasonable assumptions for going forward reference case.
So we got a question about specifically the interplay between renewable portfolio standard policies and IRPs. You talked a little bit about building in environmental regulations in general, but can you comment a little bit on how you work with policies that affect the amount of resources that you have to have on the system?
You want me to take that one? So renewable portfolio standards are, I would almost say, one of the easier policies to include in an IRP. I mean, in your model, you can set a constraint that says we need X% or Y gigawatt hours of renewable energy in this year, and the model will build and operate resources to meet that standard. And so it's important, if that's a legislated policy, that that's a constraint in the model that it has to meet, and in your reference case, as we were just talking about.
Another question that we've gotten is about trying to dig in a little bit to the idea of determining what scenario or what resources are least cost, and how that's evolving over time. So want to think about short-term and long-term costs. We want to think about things that are externalities, so they don't necessarily have market costs. How is this typically done? Are there improving ways to do this?
Sure. So the typical, and first of all, we'll go back to this question that was raised early on by Ariel in terms of what is optimal. And all of these models that we're discussing, and in many cases, actually, state regulatory requirements require that the modeling and that the planning seek an objective function, as in seek to find the least cost, which is defined in many jurisdictions as being the lowest net present value of revenue requirements, so your lowest overall system cost. So that takes into account both your short-term costs as well as your long-term costs. And for the perspective of your, for all of those, it's discounting back to today's dollars. So today's costs matter a little bit more than those costs that are 5 years out, and those matter a lot more than costs that are 20 or 30 years out overall. That being said, there are other considerations that go into choosing that least cost, least risk portfolio. You might find that the portfolio that you think is actually least cost is actually subject to quite a lot of risk due to fluctuations in fuel prices or due to uncertainty in environmental regulations or demand or capital cost, in which case there might be something that's actually a less optimal, a slightly higher cost resource option that's just more robust. And so, you know, if you have two resource plans that are pretty close cost, but one of them survives under more sensitivities as a lower cost option, then maybe that has some merits to look at overall. Some jurisdictions also do look at other types of considerations in choosing that least cost plan, whether it has a substantial increase in your term rates is often of concern to regulators. And then also the consideration of externalities is really an open question in a lot of jurisdictions in terms of whether you actually price things in the same model, where, just to be clear, when we're talking about externalities, we're talking about things that happen to society that have a monetary equivalence but don't necessarily have a market value to them. And so when we're talking about putting externalities into resource planning, there can be a question as to, well, both what that monetary value is and whether it goes into the base construction of that resource plan.
Yeah, that's a good response. Just to put a quick little clarification on that, in integrated resource planning, we're looking for least cost plans, not identifying resources that are least cost. So you could have a resource, for example, that's the lowest capital cost or even the lowest levelized cost of energy, but you have to think about that in the context of your system as a whole and how that operates with your system to get a sense of what your plan is for the next 5 or 20 years.
And that can be because that resource displaces something or pushes something else off the system or causes it to dispatch less. Just having the lowest cost of energy doesn't necessarily give you the least cost plan. Right.
Yep.
So we're talking here about things that are forward-looking, plans for the future, but we got a question about retrospective analyses of planning, and if anybody ever looks back at their past plans to see if their assumptions were accurate, if their models produced results that led them to make prudent decisions, do people evaluate this?
The Energy Information Administration does do look-backs at the annual energy outlook, the mechanism that the Department of Energy uses to come up with forecasts of long-term commodity prices, long-term demand, how they think the overall energy sector is going to shift over time. And I've got a feeling that probably there's some academic groups that do some look-backs also, and Patrick, I'll be interested in what you know about that. I don't think I've ever seen utility scale planning that's gone back and looked at retrospective decision making, except in the context of prudence reviews, in which case you're making a decision and then you're going back and looking back a couple of years later to see what you did in terms of that decision. But again, when you make when you're making a prudence determination, this is a completely different world. You're looking back at the information that you knew at the time. And so even though you now know better, the information that you now know better doesn't count in terms of what you were looking back at that time. So I don't think I've actually seen too many utility scale retrospective analyses about what we thought then versus what's happened now, but it sounds like a great research project.
Yeah, I think that's important. I mean, you definitely see that sort of retrospective for the academic models. It's a helpful thing to say when you're publishing a paper in a journal that you've reviewed how this model performs. For some reason, we don't see it as much at these utility levels. I think utilities have done some of that, and the model developers have done some of that, but it usually takes a back seat and is referenced in just a sentence or two in most of the reports that we've seen, and I would really be interested in seeing some of that.
So some of our participants out there are facing the challenge of not having a lot of transparency in their state's IRP process. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that. What are some solutions to that or workarounds when the materials involved in the IRP process and even some of the discussions are simply not open to all stakeholders?
I'm going to start off by talking about just the importance of having an open, transparent process, because I think that it is a widely held sentiment, but I don't know if it's necessarily commonly realized in terms of just how important that is. I think stakeholders hold two really critical roles in the development of resource planning. One is in helping ensure that there are an appropriately wide number of options being considered and futures being considered that are reasonable or achievable. You know, there could be a number of reasons that a utility might have a narrower view on a particular type of resource or a particular view of the way that regulations might evolve over time, or that demand might change over time. And those might be perfectly appropriate for that utility's viewpoint, and I think often stakeholders come in with additional views of what could be happening above and beyond. And so one role of stakeholders is to make sure that the views that are being encompassed within the IRP are sufficiently wide that you're actually testing a reasonable range of risk. The other really critical key component of stakeholders is an auditing function. This is in the review of the IRPs, in the review of the process that was used in the IRPs, and in ensuring that the assumptions that are stated in the IRPs are actually consistent with what's in the model structure itself, and that the model actually reflects what the utility says it does. And as an organization that regularly gets involved in IRPs on behalf of stakeholders to do that auditing function, I'd say that we're often in the position of not having all the information that we'd want in order to be able to actually perform that auditing function appropriately. So in terms of just the importance of it, I think that there's lots of value that's brought to the table. I say that from a somewhat biased perspective. I'm hopefully trying to represent that value that's brought to the table from stakeholders and regulators actually auditing a IRP process through a transparent, if protected, but still transparent process. In terms of workarounds, I think there are some jurisdictions that have just chosen it to be a non-transparent process, and it might require some work in those jurisdictions to create a more open forum. And in those fora, there's possibly some space to be able to do some essentially independent modeling of those systems. Basically have stakeholders come in from another standpoint and say, well, here's how we think your system might evolve based on our best information. But I think without a doubt, in almost all circumstances, the best way of being able to work collaboratively with the utility is to be able to have an open, transparent process where you can actually talk on a technical level.
Jeremy, one thing I've run into with that recently in a couple states that are trying to reform their processes and really incorporate stakeholders well is there's this pressure to use more simplified models or only publicly available data to really facilitate that engagement. But it seems like sometimes some of those models lose a lot of the detail that could be really valuable in these planning exercises. How do you negotiate that?
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is like states in which you'll have either a screening level analysis or something else that's put forward so that stakeholders can interact with the process, but really isn't the model that the utility uses to actually do its planning, or something along those lines, right?
Yes, but also some people are proposing using simpler models for the planning purposes.
Oh.
So I guess those
right.
are two
Yeah, sure.
questions,
Okay.
but.
Right. Okay. And so I think there's a role for simplified modeling for stakeholder engagement, and I think that happens in the forum of being able to make sure that you're gathering enough information to be able to do productive modeling of your system with a sufficiently wide range of risk. But I think when it really does come down to the utility doing its own modeling, it does need to use the correct state-of-the-art model that actually answers the questions that are out there. In terms of being able to interact appropriately with stakeholders, I don't think all the information needs to be public in those. I think there can be confidential and protected information as long as you have a forum and a mechanism for being able to get confidential information over to stakeholders and keep it confidential within that process. I don't necessarily think it always needs to be simplified down to the level of all stakeholders. I think there is a technical engagement that's appropriate for those. But I think there is a role for having the simplified models as a way of engaging stakeholders and a sharing of the technical information to ensure that technically minded stakeholders are able to engage at an appropriate level.
So that's all the time we have. I just want to thank the presenters again, Patrick and Jeremy, and my co-host Ariel, and then thanks everybody who's joined us today. Please come back again next Wednesday and join us to talk about renewables. Thanks everyone so much.
Thank you.